I'm very pleased to be here today to share with the viewers the results of my research here in southwestern Louisiana on Creole cattle ranching, trail riding, and rural Creole culture. My name is Alexandra Giancarlo, and I'm a PhD candidate from Queen's University in Kingston, Ontario, Canada. And I'm also an LSU grad where I did my master's degree. Few people realize that up to a quarter of those who participated in the cattle ranching industry during the open range era were Black. And the erasures of the historical contributions of Blacks to the early cattle ranching industry and agriculture are particularly glaring, given that the cowboy has a very admired and venerated position in popular culture and in American society. And so I'm thrilled to be able to tell you about the role that Creole and Black cattlemen and women played in the early settlement of southwestern Louisiana, as well as explore the enduring linkages of these traditions to the present day. My research consisted of 40 in-depth interviews with people involved in the aforementioned activities. I'm presently here in southwestern Louisiana for my second fieldwork season, undertaking research on Creole boucheries past and present. And I also wanted to come back to be able to share the findings from my ongoing research on the cattle ranching, trail riding, and rural livelihoods. I wanted to start also by giving an important note on terminology. So most of the viewers will be aware of the fact that Creole is a complicated, complex, sometimes controversial term that's highly dependent on the historical and geographical context that one is speaking about. So for our purposes, I'm talking about people of color, so these are Black people, descended from either slaves or from free people of color in southwestern Louisiana. Creoles tend to be concentrated in St. Landry and St. Martin parishes, and there was also heavy immigration into eastern Texas during the middle of the 20th century, in addition to other locations around the country. Although they live alongside the Acadians, who are most commonly now known as Cajuns, their presence actually predates the Cajuns' arrival to Louisiana. And as you're probably getting an idea, the definition has become more mutable over time, and presently could be considered to encompass all of Black South Louisiana or anyone who lays claim to this identity. So in that vein, what I discovered from my interviews was that there was some variation on how people identified as Creole. Some people use the word Creole to mean both their race and their culture. Some people I interviewed said that they were Black or African American, and this would have been actually the majority of the interviewees, with Creole as their heritage or their legacy or their culture. I'm going to begin by discussing the historic Attakapaw District and outlining its importance for the topic at hand, for the early contributions of Blacks to the cattle ranching industry. The Attakapaw District consists of present-day Lafayette, St. Martin, Iberia, Vermilion, and St. Mary parishes. And by 1720, we know that the Tunica, Avoyelles, and the Caddo were bringing cattle into the region from Texas and originally from Mexico. The French began to trade with the Native Americans and thus increased their herds. Brasseur, who's a scholar from UL in the anthropology department, tells us that there was a racially mixed French-speaking society of cattle herders along the Bayou Teche by 1765. And this would have consisted of French traders, Native Americans, and Black people, some free and some enslaved. And before the arrival of the Acadians, 5 mainly Black populated ranches in the Attakapaw District dominated herding. So you may wonder, why were these ranches mainly Black populated? This is because the owners most likely did not live on the ranch or the plantation. They probably lived in New Orleans for most of the year. So the people who were involved in the day-to-day operations of the ranch or the plantation would have been the enslaved, whoever else was on site, perhaps a few Native Americans. And one of the professors from LSU who's been at the forefront of helping us to reconceptualize the role of people of color in this era noted that on the census from 1766, there was a line that was especially intriguing, and it said 5 old ranches in the Attakapaw District. And under this, this heading, there was no households nor militia listed. There were 2 leagues of land, 15,000 cattle, 300 horses, 100 other livestock, 50 muskets, and 50 slaves. So seeing this entry led the scholar from LSU, whose name is Andrew Sluter, to conclude that 50 enslaved blacks armed with muskets were riding around without any direct supervision by whites on 5 neighboring ranches that contained more than half of the colony's cattle. So we're really getting an idea that people of color were in charge of the day-to-day operations of the ranch, given that most of the slaveholders did not even live on site. In one of the succession documents for one of the 5 major pre-Acadian ranchers, whose name was Leday, the occupation for one of the slaves is listed as cowboy. We know that there probably were many slaves who worked as cowboys, but it's pretty remarkable to actually have that listed in the census and have that documentation that a person of color was a cowboy on his plantation in that era. We also have a unique glimpse into the life of a black cattle driver in the 1880s. So this would have been after slavery, but in the same region along the Bayou Teche. And his name was Jack Preston, and he drove cattle from the prairie. He loaded them on steamboats at Washington, and he guided them down the bayou, through the bayou system, eventually to New Orleans. And again, this is an unusual insight into the life of a person of color during this period, because we don't have a lot of documentation, and particularly not firsthand. In the Opelousas District, during the pre-Acadian period, a unique cattle herding ecology was created. And this differed from the cattle ranching style that developed to the west, where the Acadians primarily settled shortly thereafter. And the unique cattle herding ecology was facilitated by the unique geography of the Teche Ridge area, which allowed for seasonal cattle foraging, with cattle moving up and down the ridge as floodwaters rose and fell. When floodwaters rose in the spring, the cattle moved into the woodland areas basically on top of the ridge. During the summer, as the water would recede, the cattle would move down the slope into the areas of fertile grassland. And then as the grasses died off in the winter, they would move into the marginal areas in the swamps, where they would be sheltered in the canebrakes from the wind, and where they could eat cane leaves, which remained green all winter. And those who are familiar with the Acadian system that came to be on the prairie know that the Acadians undertook long cattle drives. The prairies to the west were a different environment, and during the winter they had to drive their cattle all the way to the coastal marsh. So Professor Sluter, the professor from LSU, his research helps us to understand where this unique cattle herding system may have originated. So originally, scholars thought that the origins of the system were in the Caribbean, and thus ultimately from either France or Spain, whoever had colonized Saint-Domingue. But we now know that the pre-Acadian ranchers did not get their inspiration from the Caribbean because they did not come through the Caribbean. They actually came directly from France. And they also came from regions that did not have the open range cattle herding. So it seems unlikely that the inspiration or the source of their understanding of how to do the open range cattle herding came from their experience there. On the other hand, we do have evidence that suggests that some blacks would have had familiarity with open range cattle herding because of the region from which they came in Africa called the Senegambia. And also that region had seasonal movement between the pastures. But the Senegambians herded on foot, not from horseback, because the cattle were docile and not feral as they were in the Opelousas District. And they also used earmarks in lieu of the branding that we know was very common in this region. So Sluter looked into who may have been living on the ranches in this region. And he found some information that there were Native Americans and Griffs, these would be people who were mixed Black and Native American ancestry, who lived on one of the major pre-Acadian ranchers' properties. His name was Massey, the rancher. And we know that these groups traded cattle from Texas into Louisiana. So we now think that these techniques were introduced from Hispanics from that region who did employ branding and herding from horseback. So all of these results taken together have helped us to elevate the likely role that non-whites played in the origins of the cattle ranching industry. And Sluter says, and this is a quote, "Actors of African, European, Native, and mixed origins participated in a Creole act of creation on those first Louisiana ranches." And now turning our attention to the Opelousas District, which is present-day St. Landry, Evangeline, Acadia, Calcasieu, Cameron, Jeff Davis, Allen, and Beauregard parishes. Governor O'Reilly issued land grants in 1770, and these would have been the land grants that many Acadians availed themselves of. And land claimants were again not required to actually establish residence there. Each settler was required to prove that, quote, he owns 100 domesticated head of cattle, some horses and sheep, and that he has 2 slaves to tend to them. So the owners of most of these large ranches were not, strictly speaking, ranchers, they were slaveholders. Some sent their sons, along with the required slaves and property that I mentioned, to set up along the frontier. And it appears that others sent their mixed race, illegitimate male children who may have resulted from sexual relations with female slaves, sent these male children who were enslaved to the frontier with the promise of freedom. And once they were there, all of the slaves, regardless of how they arrived, worked under a minimum of supervision. So we're seeing, again, in this location, an increased likelihood of a creative role, not only as labor, but actually in a substantial way developing and shaping the industry and the herding ecology of the region. And we know that Creoles of color owned some of the largest and most profitable ranches in the prairie area. And as we also know, some owned slaves. However, most free blacks were small subsistence farmers. It's fascinating that some of the area's first brands on record belong to Native Americans and to blacks. From the brand book for the districts of Opelousas and Attakapaw, there are 6 brands owned by Native Americans and many hundreds owned by blacks. In fact, nearly 40% of the population of the Opelousas Post in 1788 was either consisting of black people or of free people of color. So altogether, we're seeing that enslaved peoples along the frontier would have had unusually high levels of freedom and responsibility, which was uncommon for the slaveholding South. So this is a unique feature. And evidence of this revised understanding of history is making it into the popular press, as we saw with an article from the Daily Advertiser earlier this year. The reporter singled out recreational horseback riding, or trail riding as it's called, as evidence of this important heritage. And he said, "So the next time you see a trail ride, keep in mind that there's more going on than riding a horse. You're witnessing living history, a nod to bygone days." So why was this horsemanship and land ownership so crucial and so interesting to scholars? It's because it was both a symbolic and a material expression of freedom. Horse and land ownership allowed this measure of freedom from, quote, working for the white boss man as a hand, and that's from an article by Nicholas Spitzer in 2010. During slavery, ownership of horses by slaves was viewed as so threatening that in 1829, colonial authorities enacted a series of regulations for slaves found on horseback without permission. The horses would be confiscated and sold. And the possession of horses was so strictly regulated out of fear that ownership of a horse would provide the enslaved person with resources and a means by which they could secure their freedom. One man I interviewed said that we were stewards of our own land, which gave us a deeper sense of independence and value. For another interviewee, owning land endowed his ancestors with a small measure of control. And he said, if you had land, you had power. And if you have power, you have an opinion. So you have a lot of, not a huge amount, but you have a lot of slaves or former slaves, kids of former slaves, who believed in property. And this land allowed not only physical mobility, but also the potential for social and economic influence, as I'm describing. And it's particularly striking given that 75% of black farmers in the South in the early 1900s were tenants and not landowners. Trail riding, which was the main subject of my research, is exceedingly popular among Creole people today in southwestern Louisiana and southeastern Texas. There are 8 major trail riding associations, and each association would have dozens of trail riding groups that fall underneath it. So we're talking about many hundreds and hundreds of people. The groups could have names taken from a religious commitment, such as the Southern Cross Riders, a hometown or an important geographic feature. I'm thinking of the I-49 riders, all of whom live along the I-49 corridor. Could be a favorite type of horse or any number of other meaningful identifications. I've seen some groups, one group is called Buffalo Soldiers, so we have a historical awareness or historical interest here. And I've also seen a group called 40 Acres and a Mule, as well as the Bill Pickett Trail Riders, whose name pays homage to the famous African-American cowboy who invented the sport of steer wrestling. And indeed, black trail rides are an extension of these ancestral links to cattle ranching, horseback riding, and rural livelihoods of their ancestors. From my interviews, it became apparent that trail rides have become more formalized and more commercialized in the past 20 years or so. They could have came about as an homage to horseback riding ancestors, perhaps as a recreation of cattle drives of ages past, a fundraiser for a church or other local cause, or simply evolved from horses as transportation and being used in occupations. St. Landry Parish Council proposed to ban the trail ride Step and Strut, which is one of the most prominent and well-attended trail rides in the region, in 2011 due to complaints from the public. And these complaints centered around behavior at rides, traffic, and questions of cultural importance. The public debates surrounding the potential ban were tense, and the session that council held on the ban featured dozens of trail riding supporters, including representatives from Texas trail riding groups, of which there are close to 200. And during the council debates, trail ride supporters drew comparisons with Mardi Gras, another horseback riding cultural event, and noted the massive economic benefit to the parish that the ride brings, multiple thousands of people per day, often resulting in sold-out hotel rooms, as well as supplies being completely sold out from local retailers. In interviews, trail riders were also keen to share with me their group's importance to the community. Many will donate portions of their ride proceeds to charity, and some groups were formed actually with the purpose of raising money for charity. Some favored causes of the groups include breast cancer research, support for the elderly, and children's well-being, such as scholarships and Christmas toy drives. The groups also provide financial and social support for each other, networks for job searches and for support in times of need or in tough times, such as one family who lost everything in a fire, and a couple of other trail riding groups came together and held a dinner benefit to help them get back on track. One woman I interviewed spoke to her group's commitment to community service, and she said, quote, "When you've got it in your heart to do it, you just do it. Sometimes people don't realize that there are a lot of people who are actually suffering from things. When we do it, like I know for me personally, and I can speak for them too, it kind of touches us." And that's Crystal from Brobridge. One of the most fascinating things for me to explore and to learn about over the course of my research was the fact that this really is a living history. So during my first field season, I got to spend time with Creole cattlemen who were vaccinating their cows. And I also got to know a Creole cowboy who runs a horsemanship program for youth. And even for those who are not employed in the farming or ranching industry per se, in a symbolic sense, owning and riding a horse brings them back to the work of their ancestors, who may have driven cattle or wrangled wild horses, herded cows on the prairie, and whose work and activities really did challenge the societal restrictions that were in place that would have tried to stifle their movements and limit their mobility. I wanted to end with a last little vignette about two brothers who have come back to Eunice to be closer to their family and carry on the tradition whose tendrils stretch from their free people of color ancestors to their present livelihood. The older brothers said, "We grew up on family farms. Me getting to come back and do cattle work with my brother and the ranching that we do has kind of continued the heritage that our dad instilled in us. And as we go through and research our family history through genealogy projects, one recurring theme in our family on both sides is a link to agriculture and a link to raising cattle." They often work with a team of extended family and friends, herding, penning, vaccinating, and castrating their herd of 79 cattle spread across 180 acres of pasture. And importantly, they also want to pass along these traditions to the next generation. Linus's daughter is a frequent and active participant in all things ranching and very much wants to be a veterinarian, while James's son exhibits livestock and helps him to work cattle as well. So in conclusion, our understandings of the role of people of color, both in past terms, in historic terms, and present terms, has changed over the course of this research and the course of previous research that I was inspired by. It's become apparent that people of color have played a tremendously important role in the development of the region's distinctive cattle ranching ecology. Indeed, a long tradition of Creole cattle ranching and cowboy culture is reflected in today's trail riding and rural-focused lifeways that exemplify the living history of these people. Thank you.